Hey y'all, it's me again. Sorry about stopping before I could. It's just that my phone storage was getting kind of full, so I had to delete some stuff. Okay, well, let me continue. Born in Millville, Ohio, named for the Civil War battlefield in which his father lost his leg, Landis had preferred bicycling to baseball as a boy. Before one race, he bought 20 miscellaneous medals and pinned them to his jersey just to intimidate those who dared pedal against him. As a jurist, he was best known for trying to extradite the Kaiser, for declaring free speech expendable in wartime, and for having hauled John D. Rockefeller into his courtroom to testify, then levying a huge fine against Standard Oil, in a decision that a higher court later overturned. He once sentenced a bank robber to 15 years in jail. Your Honor, the man said, I'm 75 years old. I can't serve that long. Well, Landis answered, do the best you can. Ban Johnson opposed his appointment. Keep non-baseball people out of baseball, he warned. But Landis has seen to side with the American and National Leagues in their struggle with the Federal League, and this time Johnson was outvoted by the frightened owners. The survival of their leagues was at stake. The New York Times stated the fans' case. Professional baseball is in a bad way, not so much because of the Chicago scandal, as because that scandal has provoked it to bring up all the rumors and suspicion of years past. The general effect is to wrinkle the noses of fans who will quit going to ball games if they get the impression that this sort of thing has been going on underground for years. The day after the 8 Chicago players were acquitted, Judge Landis barred them all from baseball for life. Regardless of the verdict of juries, he declared, he decreed, no player who throws a ball game, no player that undertakes or promises to throw a game, no player that sits in conference with a bunch of crooked players and gamblers, where the ways and means of throwing a game are discussed and does not promptly tell his club about it, will ever play professional baseball. Exit 8 players. Even Buck Weaver, who had known of the plot but had neither participated in it nor profited from it, was permanently barred. 6 times he begged Landis to reinstate him, but the judge was unmoved. I had Weaver in this office, he told the delegation of the players' sympathizers. I asked him, Buck, did you ever sit in on any meeting to throw the 1919 World Series? He replied, yes, Judge, I attended 2 such meetings, but I took no money and played the best ball I am capable of. So I told him anyone who sat in such a meeting did not report it was as guilty as any of the others. But you can't play ball with us again. Happy Felch was rueful. I got $5,000, he said. I could have just got about that much by being on the level of the Sox and won the series. And now I'm out of baseball. The only profession I knew anything about, and a lot of gamblers have gone rich. The joke seems to be on us. Joe Jackson played outlaw baseball on several southern teams under pseudonyms, then opened a liquor store in Greenville, South Carolina. Ty Cobb once came in for a fifth of bourbon. Jackson did not seem to recognize his old rival. Cobb finally asked, don't you know me, Joe? Sure. I know you, Ty, Jackson answered. I just didn't think anyone I used to know up there wanted to recognize me again. In appointing Judge Landis commissioner of baseball, the club owners had done their best to reassure the public that the game's honesty had been restored, but fans remained skeptical. Something or someone else was needed to revive their shattered faith. Chapter 3. America enters the world arena. The Panama Canal unites the oceans. David McCullough. A marvelous engineering feat of the early 1900s was the digging opening of the Panama Canal in Central America. With its completion, ships could more quickly pass from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, and the United States could more easily assure her power in both bodies of water. Renowned historian David McCullough, who has written extensively on topics of 20th century America, summarized the canal's completion and impact in the 1977 book. For all practical purposes, the canal was finished when the locks were, and so efficiently construction of the locks been organized that they were finished nearly a year earlier than anticipated. Had it not been for the slides in the cut, adding more than 25 million cubic yards to the total amount of excavation, the canal might have opened in 1913. The locks on the Pacific side were finished first. A single flight at Pedro Miguel in 1911, Miraflores in May 1913. Morale was at an all-time high. Asked by journalists what the secret of success had been, Chief Engineer George Gonzalez answered, "The pride everyone feels in the work. Men reported to work early and stay late without overtime," Robert Wood remembered. "I really believe that every American employed would have worked that year without pay, if only to see the first ship pass through the completed canal. The spirit went down to all laborers." The last concrete was laid at Guton on May 31st, 1913, 11 days after two steam shovels had met on the bottom of the canal in Culebra. Shovel number 222, driven by Joseph S. Kirk, and shovel number 230, driven by D.J. McDonald, had been slowly narrowing the gap all day when they at last stood nose to nose. The cut was as deep as it would go, 40 feet above sea level. In the second week in June, it would be reported that the newly installed upper guard gates at Guton had been swung to a position halfway open, then shut, open wide, closed, and noisily without any jar or vibration, and at all times under perfect control. On June 27th, the last of the spillway gates were closed at Guton Dam. The lake at Guton reached a depth of 48 feet. Now it will rise to its full height. Excavation ends. 3 months later, all dry excavation ended. The Cucaracha slice still blocked the path, but Gonzalez had decided to clear it out with dredges once the cut was flooded. So on the morning of September 10th, photographers carried Digger into the cut to record a large rock being lifted by the last steam shovel. Locomotive number 260 hauled out the last dirt train, and the work crews moved in to tear up the last of the track. The cut tonight presented an unusual spectacle, cabled a correspondent for the New York Times. Hundreds of piles of old ties from the railroad tracks being in place. Now on September 26th at Guton, the first trial lockage was made. A seagoing tug, Guton, used until now for hauling mud barges in the Atlantic after it was cleaned up, decorated with all the flags it owned, and came plowing up from the Coulon in the early morning sunshine. By 10 o'clock, several thousand people were clustered along the rims of the lock walls to witness the historic asset. There were men on the tops of the closed lock gates, leaning on the handrails. The sky was cloudless, and in midair above the lower gates, a photographer hung suspended from the cablewood. He was standing in the cement bucket, his camera on a tripod, waiting for things to begin. But it was to be a long, hot day. The water was let into the upper chamber shortly after 11. But because the lake had still to reach its full height, there was a head of only about 8 feet, and so no thunderous rush ensued when the valves were opened. Indeed, the most fascinating aspect of this phase of the operation, so far as the spectators were concerned, was the quantity of frogs that came swirling in with the muddy water. With the upper lock filled, however, the head between it and the middle lock was 56 feet, and so when the next set of was open, the water came boiling up from the bottom of the empty chamber in spectacular fashion. The central control board was still not ready. All valves were being worked by local control room and with extreme caution to be sure everything was just so. Nor were any of the towing locomotives in service as yet. Just filling the locks took the whole afternoon. It was nearly 5 by the time the water in the lowest chamber was even with the surface of the sea level approach outside, and the huge gate split apart and wheeled slowly back into the niches in the walls. The initial testing. The tug steamed into the lower lock, looking, as one man recalled, like a chip on a pond. Silbert showed her young George Goethals and their wives were standing on the prow. The colonel and Hodges were on top of the lock wall, walking from point to point, both men in their shirt sleeves. Goethals carrying a frilled umbrella, Hodges wearing glossy puttees and an enormous white hat. The gates had opened in 1 minute 48 seconds, as expected. The tug proceeded on up through the lock step by step. The gates to the rear of the first chamber was closed. The water in the chamber was raised until it reached the same height as the water on the other side of the gates ahead. The entire tremendous basin swirled and turned as if being stirred by some powerful unseen hand, and the rise of the water out of the little boat was very apparent. Those on board could feel themselves being lifted as if in a very slow elevator. With the water in the lower chamber equal to that in the middle chamber, the intervening gates were open and the tug went forward. Again, the gates to the stern swung shut. Again, with the opening of the huge subterranean coverts, the caramel-colored water came suddenly to life and began its rise to the next level. It was 6:45 when the last gates were opened and the third and last lock, and the tug steamed out onto the surface of Goton Lake. The day had come and gone. It was very nearly dark, and as the boat turned and pointed to shore, her whistle blowing, the crowd burst into a long cheer. The official time given for this first lockage was 1 hour and 51 minutes, or not quite twice as long as it would be required once everything was in working order. The final touches. That an earthquake should strike just 4 days later seems somehow a fitting additional touch. It is that too were essential in any thorough testing and proving drill. It lasted more than an hour, one violent shudder following another, and the level of magnitude appears to have been greater than that of the San Francisco quake of 1906. The needles of a seismograph at Ancon were jolted off the scale paper. Walls cracked in buildings in Panama City. There were landslides in the interior. A church fell, but the locks in Goton Dam were untouched. There has been no damage whatever to any part of the canal, Goethals notified Washington. Water was let into Silabura Cut that same week through 6 big drain pipes and the earth dike at Gamboa. Then, on the afternoon of October 10th, President Wilson pressed a button in Washington and the center of the dike was blown sky high. The idea had been dreamed up by newspapermen. The signal relayed by telegraph wire from Washington to New York to Galveston to Panama was almost instantaneous. Wilson walked from the White House to an office in the Executive Building, as the State, War, and Navy Building had been renamed, and pressed the button at 1 minute past 2. At 2 minutes past 2, several hundred charges of dynamite opened a hole more than 100 feet wide in the cut, already close to full, at once became an extension of Goton Lake. In all the years that the work had been moving ahead in the cut and on the locks, some 20 dredges of different kinds, assisted by numbers of tugs, barges, and crane boats, had been laboring in the sea level approaches of the canal and in the 2 terminal bays, where 40-foot channels had been dug several miles out to deep water. Much of this was equipment left behind by the French. 6 dredges in the Atlantic Fleet, 4 in the Pacific Fleet, a dozen self-propelled dump barges, 2 tugs, 1 drill boat, 1 crane boat were all holdovers from the earlier era. Now to clear the cut slides, about half this equipment was brought up through the locks. The first procession from the Pacific side passing through Miraflores and Pedro Miguel on October 25th. The great awkward dredges took their positions in the cut. Barges shunted in and out, dumping their spoil and designated out of the way corners of Gatun Lake, all in the very fashion that Felipe Bonavera, agent for the French company that had begun the canal project, had for so long championed as the only way to do the job. Floodlights were installed in the cut and the work went on day and night. On December 10th, 1913, an old French ladder dredge, the Marmont, made the pioneer cut through the Cucaracha slide, thus opening the channel for free passage. The first complete passage of the canal took place almost incidentally as part of the new workday routine on January 7th, when an old crane boat, the Alexandra La Valley, which had been brought up from the Atlantic side some previously, came down through the Pacific locks without ceremony, without much attention of any kind. That first boat through the canal was French, seemed to everyone altogether appropriate. The job winds down. Sorry if I sound a little sick, it's just that my allergies are acting up way much. So I'm not sick, it's just my nose is really, really more stuffy now than normal. The end was approaching faster than anyone had anticipated. Thousands of men were being let go. Hundreds of buildings were being disassembled or demolished. Job applications were being written to engineering offices in New York and to factories in Detroit, where, according to the latest reports, there was great opportunity in the automobile industry. Families were packing for home. There were farewell parties somewhere along the line almost every night of the week. William Gorgas resigned from the Canal Commission to go to South Africa to help fight an alarming surge of pneumonia among black workers in the gold mine. The understanding was that it would be a brief assignment, after which he was to be made Surgeon General of the Army. Joseph Buckland Bishop left to resume his literary career in New York. With the arrival of the new year, the Eastman Canal Commission was disbanded and President Wilson named Gonzales the first governor of the Panama Canal, as the new administrative entity was to be officially known. Gonzales' salary as governor was to be $10,000 a year, which was $5,000 less than what he had been paid as chairman of the ICC, a division made in the Senate, which inspired the popular Mr. Dooley, the syndicated creation of Here is Finley Pierre done to observe. They say republics are ungrateful, but look, will you, what they've done for that fellow that chopped the continent into a Panama. He's a hero, I grant you, although I'm sorry for it because I can't pronounce it. What is he going to get? Says he. Why, Hennessy thought government has already appointed him governor. The canal is a greatly rejoiced salary. In Washington, after a drawn-out, acrimonious debate, Congress determined that the clause in the Hay Bonaparte Treaty stipulating that the canal would be open to the vessels of all nations on terms of entire equality meant that American ships could not use the canal toll-free, as many had ardently wanted and as much of the press had argued for. American ships would pay the same as the ships of every other nation, 90 cents per cargo ton. In Washington also and in San Francisco, plans were being made for tremendous opening celebrations intended to surpass even those at the opening of the Suez Canal. More than 100 warships, the greatest international fleet ever gathered in American waters, were to assemble off Hampton Roads on New Year's Day, 1915. Then proceed to San Francisco by way of Panama. At San Francisco, they arrived for the opening of the Panama Pacific International Exposition, a mammoth World's Fair in celebration of the canal. The estimate was that it would take 4 days for the Armada to go through the locks. School children of Oregon wrote to President Wilson to urge that the old battleship Oregon lead the flotilla through the canal. The idea was taken up by the press and by the Navy Department. The officer who had commanded the ship on her famous race around the Horn in 1898, retired Admiral Charles Clark, hale and fit at age 70, agreed to command her once again, and the president was to be his honored guest. The first ship passes through. But there was to be no such pageant. The first ocean-going ship to go through the canal was a lowly cement boat, the Cristobal. And on August 15, the grand opening was performed almost perfunctorily by Ancon. There were no world luminaries on her prow. Gatals again watched from shore, traveling from point to point on the railroad. The only impressive aspect of the event was the ease and system with which everything worked, as wrote one man on board. So quietly did she pursue a way that a strange observer coming suddenly upon the scene would have thought that the canal had always been in operation, and that the Ancon was only doing what thousands of other vessels must have done before her. Though the San Francisco Exposition went ahead as planned, all but the modest festivities surrounding the canal itself had been cancelled. For by ironic, tragic coincidence, the long effort at Panama and Europe's long reign of peace drew to a close at precisely the same time. It was as if two powerful and related but vastly different impulses, having swung in huge arcs in the 40-some years since Sedan, had converged with eerie precision in August 1914. The storm that had been gathering over Europe since June broke on August 3rd. The same day, the Cristobal made the first ocean-to-ocean transit. On the evening of the 3rd, the French Premier René Viviani received a telephone call from the American ambassador, who, with tears in his voice, warned that the Germans would declare war within the hour. The American ambassador was Myron T. Sherrick, who had once been so helpful to Felipe Buena Virola, and at the same moment in Panama, where it was still 6 hours earlier in the day, Felipe Buena Virola was standing at the rail of the Cristobal as she entered the lock at Pedro Miguel at the start of a descent to the Pacific, he being one of the very few who had come especially for the occasion. Across Europe and the United States, World War filled the newspapers and everyone was soft. The voices of the Cristobal, the Ancon's crossing to the Pacific on August 15th, the official declaration that the canal was open to the world, were buried in the back pages. There were editorials hailing the victory of the canal builders, but the great crescendo of popular interest had passed. A new heroic effort commanded world attention. The triumph at Panama suddenly belonged to another and very different era. The canal exacts its toll. Of the American employees in Panama at the time the canal was open, only about 60 had been there since the beginning in 1904. How many black workers remained from the start of the American effort or from an earlier time is not recorded. But one engineer on the staff, a Frenchman named Arthur Raggy, had been first hired by the Compagnie Nouvelle in 1894. Gattal, Silber, Hodges, Schudauer, Goldmark, and the others had been on the job for 7 years, and the work they performed was of quality seldom ever known. Its cost had been enormous. No single structural effort in American history had exacted such a price in dollars or in human life. Dollar expenditure since 1904 totaled $3,052,000, including the $10 million paid to Panama and the $40 million paid to the French company. By present standards, this does not seem a great deal, but it was more than 4 times what Suez had cost without even considering the sum spent by the two preceding French companies, and so much more than the cost of anything ever before built by the United States government as to be beyond compare. Taken together, the French and American expenditures came to about $6,039,000. The other cost since 1904, according to the hospital records, was 5,609 lives from disease and accident. No fewer than 4,500 of these had been black employees. The number of white Americans who died was about 350. If the deaths incurred during the French era are included, the total price of human life may have been as high as 25,000, or 500 lives for every mile of the canal. Yet amazingly, unlike any such project on record, unlike almost any major construction of any kind, the canal designed and built by the American engineers had cost less than dollars than it was supposed to. The final price was actually $23 million below what had been estimated in 1907, and this despite the change in the width of the canal and then an additional $11 million for fortifications, all factors not reckoned in the early estimate. The volume of additional excavation resulting from slides, something over 25 million cubic yards, was almost equal to all the useful excavation accomplished by the French. The digging of Culebra Cut ultimately cost $90 million, or $10 million a mile. Had such a figure been anticipated at the start, it is questionable whether Congress would have ever approved the plan. The total volume of excavation accomplished since 1904 was 2,032,044,945 cubic yards, and this added to the approximately 30 million cubic yards of useful excavation by the French, gave a grand total in round numbers of 2,062,000,000 cubic yards, or more than 4 times the volume originally estimated by Ferdinand de Lesseps for a canal at sea level, and nearly 3 times the excavation at Suez. The canal had also been opened 6 months ahead of schedule, and this too in the face of all those difficulties and changes unforeseen 7 years before. The canal's benefits. Without question, the credit for such a record belongs chiefly to George Gathalls, whose courage and tenacity were of the highest order. That so vast and costly an undertaking could also be done without graft, kickback, payroll padding, any of the 101 forms of corruption endemic to such works seemed almost inconceivable at the start, nor does it seem any less remarkable in retrospect. Yet the canal was, among so many other things, a clean project. No excessive profits were made by any of the several thousand different firms dealt with by the ICC. There had not been the least hint of scandal from the time Gathalls was given command, nor has evidence of corruption of any kind come to light in all the years since. Technically, the canal itself was a masterpiece of design and construction. From the time they were first put in use, the locks performed perfectly. Because of the First World War, traffic remained comparatively light until 1918, only 4 or 5 ships a day, less than 2,000 ships a year on average, and not until July of 1919 was there a transit of an American armada to the Pacific. That spectacle Theodore Roosevelt had envisioned so long before. 33 ships returning from the war zone, including 7 destroyers and 9 battleships, were locked through the canal, all but 3 in just 2 days. 10 years after it opened, the canal was handling more than 5,000 ships a year. Traffic was approximately equal to that of Suez. The British battle cruiser Hood and the U.S. carrier Saratoga and Lexington squeezed through the locks with only 2 feet to spare on their way to the Pacific in the 1920s. By 1939, annual traffic exceeded 7,000 ships. So please comment and rate please comment, rate, and subscribe down below. And if you're on YouTube, please ring that bell notification so that you can know when I upload. And if you're on TikTok, please like and follow my videos. And let's get to 50 followers on TikTok and 50 subscribers on YouTube so that I can do something special for you guys, okay? And please pay for something on either my eBay and or my card, okay? Bye. Have a nice Friday.